Heinrich and I haven't done a live lecture in 3 years. So, but we are ecstatic to be here. I'm so ecstatic to be in with people. It's so nice. So we are rusty, but ecstatic. So thank you very much for having us. This lecture actually illustrates how Heinrich and I work together. We both prepared separately, our own things, and then hoping that it will somehow come together and the magic will unfold. So thank you. What we're going to talk about tonight is less about the buildings that we produce, but more about the methods, more about the ways that we work, the way we collaborate. And we've structured the talk around a couple of themes. The first one is around this idea of double projects, which I'll talk about. This idea of multiple outcomes, which I'll also elaborate on. Heinrich will talk about this idea of new ways of seeing and new ways of knowing. I will then also talk a little bit about this idea of walking with others. Heinrich will talk about this idea of fragments and inhabiting the horror, but then finding the joy. So that's the broad outline of what we're going to talk about. And do you want to say anything?
Maybe I can just start by saying it's this wonderful invitation to talk about the way we work rather than our work. And maybe I can start it with a problem statement saying, well, how is it that you could do a R1 billion building, be absolutely responsible, professional and everything, and be outrageously disorderly? Is it possible? Is it really? Because there's one kind of a world where there's a demand for a person who dresses well, who can take minutes, issue drawings with regularity, have issue slips, commit to deadlines 2 years in advance, make it within budgets, make it within timelines, all sorts of things. And on the other hand, there's the celebrated idea of the cultural disruptor, somebody who just doesn't give a damn, who does anything. Now, there is an inherent tension between this so-called creature of habit and the provocateur. And the question is, how do we bring that together? Is that irreconcilable? Does it take two different kinds of people to do that in society? Or is it possible to have a responsible practice, professional outfit, and be deeply disruptive in your practices? Yeah. That's what we're aiming for, and we'll try and show you how we do it.
Okay, so what do we do about the lights? Thank you.
That's what you do about the lights.
Okay. Double projects. What we try and do with this idea of double projects is because very often we get commissioned. We get commissioned to look at buildings in critical ways through things like heritage impact assessments or studies or feasibility studies. So we do that for the clients, but then there's also another project that we do where we actually try and figure it out for ourselves. One of the most important double project or secondary project that we had in the office was the study of the Rex Trueform building, which then culminated in a book that transformed our thinking about modernist structures and the way modernist structures are entangled with conceptions of identity formation, race and gender, and how the city is planned and organized along that. It came out of a commission to do a heritage impact assessment, funny enough, and it became this big thing. It became this other thing, it became a book and it became a transformative project for us. But a more recent one that we've been engaged in is a building called the Rhodes Cottage. So I'm going to read something that Bessie Head said, and I was hoping to actually play it for you all, her voice, but the internet apparently is very bad, so I'm going to try my best to read in Bessie Head's voice. The best way I can explain it is in the words of an industrial millionaire who used his money to conquer the interior of southern Africa. His main area of conquest, and he waged 2 wars against the people, was Zimbabwe, which formerly had his name Rhodesia. When he waged the last war of conquest in 1896, he said, "I have taken everything from them but the air." The problem is more acute in South Africa. You look across the land as a black person and you feel choked. You feel like even the air has been taken because so many vast areas has been reserved for white occupation only. There's nothing there for black people. Bessie Head, an interview in 1984 in Adelaide, Australia. So in mid-2021, last year, we were appointed through a public tender process by the City of Cape Town to develop a conservation management plan for Rhodes Cottage. The scope of the work included writing a statement of significance based on the history of the site, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, SWOT analysis, and an action plan that would cover the management of the site in terms of securing public safety, site conservation, education, and research. In other words, we were awarded the task of outlining how this building should be managed for public use. But in order to do this task mindfully and creatively, we first had to understand the building and its historic presence for ourselves. We aligned our thinking with the opening epigraph of this talk from Bessie Head's words, the voice of Bessie Head, and therefore our attitude and approach towards the Rhodes Museum could not be politically neutral. The building is a modest but stately sea-facing cottage along False Bay of Cape Town and functions as a house museum dedicated to the life of Cecil John Rhodes. It formed part of Rhodes's very large estate, an estate that once included the University of Cape Town, Grooteskies Manor House, Boschendal Farm, and Kirstenbosch Gardens. Rhodes acquired this house as a holiday cottage in 1899 in Muizenberg, an area which at the time consisted of a few farms and a number of fishing huts. The timing of Rhodes's purchase and his use of the house coincides with the South African War, which occurred between 1899 and 1902. The war officially began on 11 October 1889, in part as a consequence of the failed Jameson raid, instigated by Rhodes and his compatriots in 1885. During the war, Rhodes spent time in Muizenberg. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Muizenberg, but it's one of my favorite spots in Cape Town to go for, just for walks and for family outings. And he was soon followed by other wealthy mining magnates who built extravagant colonial-style seasides, mostly mining magnates from Johannesburg. And wounded British soldiers also were brought to Muizenberg, where a camp was set up for their recuperation. The war ended on 31 May 1902, a few months after Rhodes's death. Despite owning many more illustrious and expansive properties in Cape Town, he chose this relatively humble cottage near the Atlantic Ocean because he was ill and I quote, because of access to fresh air, which was very beneficial for him in order to recover from a lifelong medical condition which affected his heart and lungs. He spent weeks in the front room of the cottage with an oxygen cylinder by his bed, and the gas was fed to him by a glass funnel held in front of his face. He also requested his aides to crudely knock a hole in the wall of his bedroom opposite the window to allow a through breeze. So we could include more details of his death in this talk, like the fact that the Union of Southern African Government obeyed Rhodes's request that his remains be transported by train from his house in Muizenberg to the Matopo Hills, a massive granite hill situated southeast of Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, just over 2,000 kilometers away, and stopping at every major city along the way for mourners to pay respect. Or the fact that at some point the railway line stopped and was extended by black Zimbabweans as the procession went underway. But these and other details are contained in the House Museum itself and framed as triumphant terms and as homage to Rhodes. These details are not framed to viewers as a critique of the violence that Rhodes represent for the Southern African region. Nowhere in the house do you find, for instance, the song Cecil Rhodes, composed by Yuma Sekela and recorded on the 1976 album Colonial Man, nor do you find any books by Dambudzo Marashera, a Zimbabwean writer who grew up in Rhodesia under Ian Smith's regime in the 1950s and 60s, and then, with cutting precision, described the colonial situation in books such as Black Sunlight and House of Hunger. These and other sources are largely absent in the house. It is as if the house itself is a curious, stuffy, damp, secret vault of information that sit outside, but simultaneously right next to some of the most socially transformative uprising against the legacy of Rhodes, such as the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which was instigated by students and staff at South African universities in 2015. So the task of this talk and, the CMP that we put forward, the Conservation Management Plan, is to carve out a new future present for this space as we continue to live in the afterlives of slavery, as sort of thought about through people like Saidiya Hartman. Colonization and colonial British rule constructed infrastructure with the labor of enslaved people of various descent, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and Angola. Slavery was abolished in 1834 to 1838, and ex-enslaved Muslim people settled as fishermen and women in the area. Later, the fishing community was joined by Filipino migrants in the 1850s. The mosque built in 1846 in Quarterdek Road is an architectural testament to the Muslim fisher community of the time, and similarly, the Catholic Church in St. James was built in 1858 by congregants of Filipino descent. The Long Cottage, adjacent to Rhodes Cottage, contains remnants of a fisherman cottage from 1856. And these remnants may very well be what is today referred to as the caretaker's cottage on the far corner of the Rhodes Cottage Museum. So with this information in hand, we worked quite diligently and quickly. It was a 3-month thing, like they wanted the whole CMP to be done within their financial year. Luckily, they had a really nice archive, and we had to work really quickly. And we proposed a report that is both practical for the purpose of guiding maintenance of the fabric, yet that would also shift the ethics of engagement around the narrative of the space. In 1938, the cottage was donated to the City of Cape Town by the Rhodes Trust. The deed of transfer stipulated that the condition of transfer is that it would function as a museum for Rhodes in perpetuity, a condition that was welcomed and gladly accepted at the time. Currently, the building is dominated by the history of Rhodes, who lived and died there between 1898 and 1902. The building and the site is over 200 years old. And our plan proposed a broader, more inclusive retelling of the history on the site. The history includes those of enslaved people, working class black, brown, and immigrant histories, and histories beyond the borders of South Africa. Yet, the main stakeholder. Okay, so what happened was, we proposed our plan. The City of Cape Town was very happy. They were on board with a kind of doubleness of the proposal. On the one hand, very practical maintenance schedule. On the other hand, let's do something else. But the main stakeholder was the Muizenberg Historical Conservation Society, and I've decided I'm going to call them the Muizenberg Hysterical Conservation Society in everything that I write. They heavily opposed the plan and submitted an 11-page document undermining and contesting the plan on the grounds that its purpose is to delegitimize the property and that Rhodes should be erased completely or relegated to a dark corner and roughly cancelled in the most brutal terms. These are the quotes, these are the things that they wrote back to us. MHCS was also contest that we as heritage practitioners, as heritage architects, should be neutral, that our activism slant is unprofessional, that our references to the various settler colonial regimes that claimed ownership of the land are, and I quote, disparaging remarks aimed at nothing more than the cancellation of white society. This is what they wrote me. Crazy. And that the paragraph on the urban context is viciously anti-white. We were also told that our research on the presence of enslaved people's histories were emotive. Finally, and here I must not deny that I was indeed emotionally provoked when I read this phrase from the MHCS in reference to our relaying of the fact that indigenous societies roamed and occupied the landscape. So they wrote to me in this 11-page document, they said, the Khoi were largely extirpated by smallpox by the middle of the 18th century, and their migration routes were lost to them. In sociological terms, they were displaced by a more powerful society. This is happening in 2021. People are writing this in 2022. We received it in November 2021. So there's a real struggle. There's a real violence that still occurs on a daily. We were prepared for some pushback, but the extent to which it would reveal certain parts of society's commitment to denying historical spatial violence was an unwelcome surprise. It reinforced our sense that a constant practice of work is required that refuses and questions dominant histories of place and to offer renewed insights that are both practical, conceptual, and imaginative. The engagement affirmed that we should indeed embrace the unprofessional nature of the task in order to invoke change. Ultimately, our working methodology relies on a continuous search for ways of how to broaden our profession as architects beyond the construction of buildings, but also towards the construction of social cohesion and spaces of freedom. It's a long story. It's an important story. And to return back to Bessie Head, she writes about how a house should be a place for breathing peace. And our hope for the Rhodes Cottage is that it becomes a space for breathing, since that is actually the heritage of the space. Rhodes went there because he couldn't breathe. So we need to make the space breathe again for people to be able to heal from the violence that he invoked.
You're going to tell them about the movie.
Yeah, we're busy making a movie. We need funding for the movie.
Let's get on to it.
We need funding, but we're making, this is not actually a double project, it's a triple project. But we return again to Bessie Head and a project called Summer Flowers. And so Bessie Head wrote somewhere that she was mainly working on the manner in which the people lost the land. We produced a pamphlet called Summer Flowers, a tour of observation that included the gathering and the pressing of plant fragments from forced removal sites in Cape Town, a film documenting a house in Serowe, and again, a visual and textual handmade publication in honor of her work and her statements on land and dispossession. One of the things Saul Plaatje did was to move through Southern Africa as a whole. He moved up to what was then called Bechuana land, which is today Botswana. South African-born Botswana writer Bessie Head found Saul Plaatje's work when she was researching how exactly people lost the land in Southern Africa. And finding Plaatje's work was a revelation for her in such a way that she describes native life, which is the kind of tactile document of his observation, as, and I quote, a missing link in the history of Southern Africa. She wrote the foreword to the 1982 republication of Native Life, and she describes the book as a text of flaming beauty. So we got interested in Bessie Head by the fact that her house in Serowe was declared a Botswana National Heritage Site. I found the plan of her house on the internet, drawn by Tom Holzinger, a good friend of hers. If you've read Question of Power, one of the characters in this novel, Tom, is completely based on him. After Bessie's passing, Tom measured the house and drew up the plan of the house partly from memory to supplement the heritage site application. The house was Bessie Head's house from 1969 up until 1986, when Mahedi's yard was used as the gathering space for her funeral. It's called Rain Clouds, named after her novel, When Rain Clouds Gather. The novel from which she was able to make enough money to design and construct the house after living rather precariously in Botswana for nearly 5 years. We filmed the house and photographs of Bessie in a garden, dressed in a yellow jersey and knee-high socks. And we found photos at the Kama Third Memorial Museum in Serowe. And that museum itself is a kind of a home for Bessie Head's archive, her letters, her writing, and anything to do with her work. Kind of an antidote to the Rhodes Museum, I think. So it's and if you are really interested in her literary legacy, you can just go and see her output. One letter, for instance, to Alice Walker expresses her thoughts on Walker's book, Revolutionary Petunias, then newly published. I'm going to try and be Bessie's voice again. I don't know when these notes are ever going to get done, as every now and then I have to stop typing and go and lie down on the floor, prostrate with worship. This often happens when one encounters a kindred soul, and in the ordinary life is indeed lonely. I have to spend a lot of time exhausting myself with people who say, "But I don't understand a word you say," when all you are saying, really, is that life is bigger and more beautiful than the narrow world each individual is trapped in. Bessie's letters are extraordinary because it shows the character of a woman that is just completely badass, completely complex, and the letters give a kind of a full glimpse of the range that was Bessie Head. To come back to Rain Clouds, the plan shows a humble 3-room cottage surrounded by a generous yard populated with garden plots and several rows of Cape gooseberry. Leading to the front door is a garden path lined with the same gooseberry bushes. Photos show a simple bagged brickwork finish, steel windows, blue wooden door, and above the lintel of the door, the hand-carved timber sign saying, Rain Clouds. I was struck by the simplicity and directness of the house. The plan of Rain Clouds is a rare encounter, perhaps even my only encounter, with a space where the arrangement shows the kitchen as the first and only room from which one enters the house. I'm familiar with entering the house through the kitchen. The house that my grandparents were relocated to in Stellenbosch from De Vlakte was through the kitchen. But being placed at the back of the house, we always entered the house then from the back. People that were familiar, family members, and close friends would use the kitchen as the entrance. Others, like priests, employers, and people that were not familiar to the family, had to enter through the front door into the front room. The room was always very formally prepared. Gladiolus flowers on the coffee table, formal portraits of the elders on the wall, brasso ornaments on the side tables, all signals that are there to display a respectable life and a respectable family. At Bessie Head's house, you don't enter into a formal dining room or sitting room. You enter straight into the kitchen. I perceive this as a very intriguing disruption in the conception of how we conceive of space and the gestures and performances of formality and familiarity. This disruption in the conceptions of space is also captured in an early poem that she wrote about her house called My Home. She writes, "Come and see my home. It's any place where nobody gives orders. Tread softly, the walls breathe peace. Deep, dark peace, and the wind don't blow." So the thing about multiple outcomes is that we can't just dwell on Bessie Head's legacy in singular terms. We had to make a film. We had to have gatherings. We had to have an installation in Chicago. We had to have a publication. She's just so big as a person. And her legacy and her work extended, that we, called for the fact that we need to extend her work and her thinking and her legacy as an architect, because I do believe Bessie Ed was an architect, and a spatial practice as a kind of a very unique emancipatory practice through the making of a house. I didn't really go into the fact that she was part of a communal practice that started a garden in Sarowe, a communal garden, but all these notions really demanded of us to pay more attention to her as a spatial practitioner and extend that as a methodology for working for us as architects in South Africa. This is just a quick slide around a design process that we engaged in with a very good friend of ours, Nadia Davids, who's a playwright and a scholar in various things around hauntology in Cape Town. Hauntology meaning that there are these presences in the city that bring up and evoke memories for people, and it needs to exist somewhere in people's social imagination. And she was, she produced this beautiful play talking about the Rockwell development that happened in Greenpoint. And according to a lot of, media coverage at the time, when they were digging to build the foundations for this apartment block, they found a huge, a huge site where, which was the grave of previously enslaved people. And these bones were taken out, very controversially, and put into an ossuary, which is today in Strand Street. It caused a lot of, it caused a lot of tension in Cape Town. It's a huge moment where the kind of ghosts really come out of the ground and begins to talk back about spatial violence in very particular ways. She produced a play, and she asked us to design the poster for the play. And at the time, we were working very much with ideas of tape, and we produced this kind of image that talks about repair through the mechanisms of using tape and using all kinds of things. So it was intuitive, and it was a conversation with Nadia, who was a very close friend of ours, talking about multiple outcomes of things. Another very important conversation for us in the practice is a conversation that we had with Mpoma Tipa, who was the curator of this very special exhibition in Munich. Well, the one iteration of the exhibition happened in Munich, but there were many iterations along the way in African cities. And we believe it's one of the most progressive thinkings around how to produce an architectural exhibition. And we were very happy that she invited us to be the exhibition designers for the installment in Munich. And our conversation was lively, it was ecstatic, it was joyful, it was free. It was really a space of freedom. And the outcomes were sort of capsulated by making these various models first, trying to figure out the curatorial project. Well, the curatorial project was very figured out. This is Paul we're talking about. So she knew what she wanted, but it was a way of figuring out what would be the aesthetic of that. So the design was first these multiple models, but it also became the actual vision for the display areas. And these models eventually became these moments within the Munich in the Munich space, which is 3 halls of 200 square meters each. And it really needed to be these large gestures to hold what Africa as a continent has to say about spatial practice. One of the more key moments in the exhibition was the Chimeringa Library, which was a space envisioned for a kind of moment of delay. Because one of the things that we saw right at the beginning is that if you traverse these 3 halls, and you really, I pretended to take in the exhibition before the exhibition was even installed. I pretended there were these beautiful things on the wall, and I walked in this empty space for as long as I thought it would take to take an exhibition. I timed myself, and I thought I was really taking my time. And towards the end of that moment, it was 1.5 minutes. which is basically what it takes for people to move through an exhibition, even if you think you're taking your time. And I said to Mpho, we really need to delay this process. We need to allow people to pause. We need to allow people to just sit and gather. And the Chimeringa Library is one of those outcomes from that conversation. And here's my friend, our friend, and Mabel Wilson in conversation with Nolan Dennis's work in the background. And this was also one of those spaces that kind of mediated the space between a real life experience and a virtual experience, kind of preempting the kind of COVID situation that we are experiencing right now. And then how does these models that are really kind of invented in the studio become these real spaces was quite a challenge, and was kind of a beautiful thing to think through with people.
I want to elaborate a little bit on how we practice architecture. And when I talk about practicing architecture, I'm not talking about the business of architecture. I'm talking about practicing like a gymnast practices jumping off a high bar and landing on their feet or something like that, or the way a pilot would practice in a flight simulator to reenact a dangerous situation in advance of doing it in real life. So there's an interest in preparatory exercises where we practice our architecture as reciprocal forms of learning and acting. And I want to elaborate on just how we do that. Practicing is a working method that accelerates one's confrontation with the consequences of your thoughts and your actions. And we, of course, do it through an architectural practice, through teaching and through writing. And in that way, we accelerate our own confrontation with the ideas that we're having. So let's just start from one side. So as you probably know, is our offices in Cape Town, and our office is as much the base of our practice as it is our vantage point. Inhabiting the physical and intellectual space of Cape Town confronts us with the discrepancies between an acquired self-definition that we were taught of ourselves and the actuality of our experience of being there in Cape Town today. We are constantly reminded of our educational backgrounds and the concomitant imaginings of what kind of work an architect does or should be doing, and how that is at odds with our sense of the real task at hand and the expressive possibilities that our time offer. It is not easy to break loose from your time and place. It's a very celebrated thing, this idea of this artist genius who just breaks loose. But it is not that easy. So one of the clearest reminders for me was in Culture and Imperialism, a book written by Edward Said. He said that in his survey of English and French literature of the entire 17th and 18th century, in both literature and scientific writing, that he found no significant dissent against the idea of imperial expansion, occupying foreign territories, or the theory of black inferiority. Now, that's 2 centuries of a lot of European writers. He found no dissent. Nobody being capable of seeing what was actually happening and making a comment about it in public. So the idea of the cultural practitioner as a disruptor is well celebrated, but creative work sits in a tension between these habitual practices that I spoke about earlier and a kind of a creativity that's very difficult to untie yourself from the expectations your teachers taught you of yourself or of your profession. So how do we cut ourselves loose from the worldview that we were educated in and that constructed images for us of our future selves? I want to elaborate on 2 practices that I believe we have to engage in as exercises to disrupt our certainty. The first one has to do with sowing confusion. So sowing confusion tills the soil of the mind. A commitment to unlearning the certainties and the bad habits of the past is as much about establishing authentic ideas and aspirations as it is about creating truly original motives for our future actions. The purpose of tilling the soil is not breaking the earth, but is it is preparatory work for the growth of a new season. So we must understand disruptive work in that sense. It's not just to be disobedient for the hell of it, but it's in a way to say, how do we till the soil for the new season? Our working methods are much about creating new understandings as they are about sowing confusion about what we know as a precursor to knowing things differently. Our work involves a great deal of unlearning as a confrontation with the epistemological basis of our knowledge and our actions. So our first confrontation is not with society, but with ourselves. The pursuit of confusion can take on many forms. At the most basic level, there's certain words we refuse to use, like what we call the S word, sustainability, or other things like informality or decolonization. Besides being polysemous, we find that these terms can allow a laziness which forecloses our engagement with the issues at hand. The avoidance of easy comprehension might at times be confusing to others, but the practice of using authentic language is the basis of new understandings and original motives in design. At a more complex level, we work hard to confuse established understandings of things, like the city, for instance. So you think you know it, and then you work hard to confuse your knowledge of it until you say, I don't know it, so that you can think about it in an original manner. The conceptual exploration, let me skip that. One of the projects that you may know about, which looks like a study, but I can point out that I've never published it. It served to educate me, firstly, and to confuse me. And that was a study called Ways of Living that studied the manner in which people live in Dunoon. Many people are poor, many people are living below the breadline, but I was interested to understand, how do people live in difficult times, in difficult spaces? What are those spaces and what amazing things come out of there? So we studied residential apartments. We studied, sorry, my eyesight's not that good. We studied bars in the public domain. We studied daycare centers and the access they give those caring mothers to the economy. We studied, that's the daycare center. We studied infrastructure like cul-de-sacs and how they become economic infrastructure for people in the motor car industry. We looked at things like taxi ranks and how primary businesses support secondary businesses, support tertiary businesses, and what the economic linkages between them are. We worked with a photographer called Masipole Feni on documenting lives of people in various conditions, educational conditions, social conditions, commercial, social conditions, and so on. And this study, in a way, was substantial in informing our work on other buildings that we built, like the watershed in Cape Town. It's a way of beginning to illustrate an understanding for ourselves of the city that we are living in. So these insights are as confusing as they are generative. Another example of a body of work in our office would be the drawings generated to explore how the protection of Table Mountain and its breathtaking beauty was part of creating an anti-black city. I'm not going to elaborate on that in the interest of time. The second practice that I want to talk about, so the first practice is the practice of sowing confusion and confusing ourselves and confusing other people. I do it with students, and this causes many kinds of confusion, but I find it very useful. The second practice I think we should elaborate here is on a commitment to description that Ilze and I are very committed to.
We can develop new perspectives and understandings by a disciplined and a non-disciplined practice of description. To learn to describe, to practice description as a probing gaze, are exercises which extend the possibilities of what we are working with. Describing what is evaded description is generative in design, in teaching, and in research. So something might be right in front of us, but nobody's been able to give it language or make a drawing of it. And we would sweat it out to just give language to it, to describe it, to point out what we are seeing, or to make a drawing that reveals what we understand. But these actions of description can also be political, because to describe can set the cat amongst the pigeons, because once it's described, it cannot be undescribed. We recently tried to describe the deliberate production of voids in the city that support the escalation of inequality. Go to the next one, please. We call this series of drawings the crime of our time. The project was a self-initiated, self-funded exploration that later became the subject of public discourse. The drawings and writings explored how the city design supports predatory capitalism to monopolize economic opportunity in designated parts of the city, and thereby desaturate other parts of the city of economic opportunity, the essential motor behind urban inequality in our mind, and inequities in our society. The geographies of the spatial strategies that produce these voids are described in these drawings. I'm not going to go into describing them in themselves. I can. Sorry? In essence, what this does, it postulates that infrastructure has the capacity to connect as much as it has the capacity to disconnect. So in this drawing, you find the N2 highway. In one direction, it connects, but as South Africans, we've learned to use this infrastructure to disconnect. So what we did in these drawings is we inverted one of the chief habits of architects and urban designers. So architects show a door open, never closed. We show a street as public, never policed. So what we did in these drawings is when public space is inaccessible or is hindered in some ways, we show it as black. We just wipe it out. So if the door can be closed, we show it shut. So anything that is an hindrance or a disconnection, we make black. So this is Langa Township. And what we see is very quickly, it's island formation, which is a very basic characteristic of its neighborhood planning that is racialized and is the basis of apartheid spatial planning. You can see Pinelands there, that's a white area. You see Pontyville areas that's designated as colored, etc., etc. And you see that there are 4 basic entrances. And then we show the plethora of owners around a white grid. So white is anything that is truly public. In other words, it belongs to the public. It's under democratic rule, and it is freely accessible. I can go there at any time and, be a citizen. But this is a series of drawings where we're trying to understand how contemporary capitalism works. So this is Century City. We show this enormous piece of land to the same scale. One piece of land, in essence, controlled by one owner. And we can see 4 entrances. So we find here the repetition of the spatial language of apartheid after the end of apartheid. How is it that a practice that was described as a crime against humanity gets to be repeated? This is why we called it the crime of our time. This is Cape Town City, the waterfront, the harbor. And you can see the colonial city, a much freer kind of a grid. There are other restrictions that is noteworthy, but we are interested in the functioning of 21st century capitalism and these big property formations and how they escalate inequality. But it is a project of description, in essence, that help us describe the city that we are living in. Okay. Another form of description we treasure is the act of making. Whether it's making a drawing, making a collage, a model, a rendering, or whatever. We keep at it until the cows come home. And you might say, but how is a drawing of a stair that you are about to build an act of description? The intentions of the mind are executed by hand, but these executions never meet those intentions precisely, and that's why I never draw on a computer. We have trained our eyes to describe what we've actually drawn, what we've actually made, what that collage is about, rather than checking conformance with the original intentions. In other words, what I do is I separate my hands from my mind as far as I can. I try and separate my feet off my body. That is what I try and do, so that these things are loose from each other, that they are entirely articulated. So why this pursuit of madness, you may ask? So the capacity to imagine differently is not just a function of an imaginative mind. It is equally the cultivated capacity to observe and describe and value the mismatch between our actions and our intentions. Because I think I'm going to draw something, and what I'm drawing is a little bit different. But if I can see it for what it is, there are two things to appreciate. There's the intention and there's the execution. This practice imagined a dismembered body that develops a bodily intelligence. So in other words, I personally, I can't speak for Ilze, I don't treasure my mind very highly. I treasure this coexistence between my mind and my bodiliness. And I believe that we attack invention to some extent by throwing our bodies at it in a sort of a dismembered way. We have to develop a hand that can draw what the mind did not think, and an eye that can see what the hand did not try to produce. I got to separate my eyes from my hands as well. If judgment is all we project onto our handwork, we miss out on the opportunity presented by reading and description. If the work of our hands are only seen through the judgment of the mind, we are missing out on the pleasures that the eye can find. The impression of a drawing by hand, so I can maybe just show this. This is a hand drawing. I struggled actually to find a hand drawing for you because I don't scan them. But there's something about this thing is loose and unpredictable, and it's unpredictability that is so treasured. Then what we do is we make drawings like this that you will say, you must certainly be done with it. And then we redraw it and redraw it and redraw it and redraw it. And then we make renderings and we redraw it and we see it in a different way. And we try and keep and having perspectives on it. So somebody recently said to us in a lecture comment, but you spend an awful amount of energy redrawing things. And we said, you had no idea. So in about 10 minutes this evening, before the lecture, we quickly put together a few images of one espalier structure in the backyard of a house. Just watch this. So here you find a drawing that set out this thing. It has some, whoops, that is the one I want to show you. It has some colors. It makes some sense. We are thinking of making a tensegrity where we can grow fig trees on so that it's cool and that it is like artificial landscapes and. Then we draw a plan of it and we draw a section of it because we want to know how does this espalier connect to the building. And we are wondering about it. We make a section and then we draw a whole site plan. We draw it with everything in us to see it as clearly as we can. And then we think, wouldn't it be cool if we make an abstraction of it? Because then we can see it much more properly. But then there's another abstraction that shows it to us in a different way, because then you can see the ground underneath. But then we can color in a section, which is a different one from the one I showed you earlier. And then we can show this if we grow a vine on it. Then somebody in the office makes a rendering. We hate renderings, but people love them. So we look at this, we talk about how much we hate the rendering, and we look at it, and then we say, but we can make a model of this. And when we make a model of it and we say, well, this is a really close reading of what it feels like to be underneath, but what is the big composition? Can we make another model of it? And then, of course, someday you have to make a set of working drawings, and this is a first of a set of 30. And so you go on. Now, what is the problem? Are we independently wealthy? Do we have too much money and boredom? No children? We don't know what to do with ourselves? Or is it that we somewhat are blind to our own insights? Or is there something about this act of remaking and redescribing, saying, if I can get this thing into my thick little skull in another way, I can understand it better, and I would know what to do. Because, God, we don't know what we're doing. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about another kind of labor. Heinrich has spoken a lot about the labor of producing through drawings and iteration. The other one is the labor of walking. We spend a lot of time walking with others through the research that we do. One particular project that we are very proud of and that has stayed with us since we actually enacted it was a walk that I did with my father in 2018 through the neighborhood that he once lived in. This is currently the neighborhood where he grew up, which is a parking lot in Stellenbosch with a Pizza Hut on the side and a Roman's Pizza, and the mosque that he used to have around in his neighborhood is still there, but the bioscope that he used to frequent is not there anymore, but it's embedded in the kind of architecture that's still around. This photograph was taken by a colleague called Shazay Matalaka, and it kind of encapsulates the day, that we asked my father to, as a public gesture, to walk us through where he once lived with his mother and grandmother and 7 other children, and to kind of think through that moment as a historic moment, but what that also means for us today. And we produced a kind of a gathering through his walking tour, and a screening of a particular film that I grew up with the story of him watching this film at the Gaiety, which was the cinema that he used to frequent. And he produced this beautiful drawing of the cinema. And this is a drawing that is literally at my desk every day, because it's a kind of a memory drawing, but it's also, my father draws very well. I think he draws like a carpenter, because I remember he used to draw these drawings to fit out the cupboards and things like that. But he, out of his own, one day just started drawing the cinema that he used to frequent, and started telling us about the story about this one particular film that he wanted to see called La Bohème, which he saw being advertised at the whites-only cinema down the road from the neighborhood. And what would happen is that the whites-only cinema would advertise the film, and then 3 weeks later it would come to the cinema for what they would term non-Europeans, but the blacks-only cinema. And he was in love with Maria Callas at the time. He just totally adored her. But La Bohème never came to the Gaiety. And for a kind of a restorative work and a kind of a thing around how do we bring justice to this space, we actually screened La Bohème on the site again. And all his friends came to watch La Bohème, and this was as sort of like an end to the walking tour that we invited him to. So in a way, this labor of walking with others is a way for us also to see what Heinrich calls the city anew, because one of the most crazy moments at the end of the tour is that a very well-known land artist in Stellenbosch came to me afterwards and said, thank you for organizing this event, because he never knew about the demolition of De Vlakte and, the history that is around him, and this is a land artist. And I thought, okay. But, it's about going through that labor and working your way through the city and with others. But it essentially came through this residency that I was very, privileged to be part of a walking residency. and was invited to in 2015, where we walked the entire Hurikwaga mountain, which is what people refer to as Table Mountain, from Cape Point to back to my office, actually, in the city center. We walked it over 5 days. And during that time, we really shared our thoughts and thinking and our ideas around how to dream differently, how to dream a city differently, how to think about emancipatory practice through spatial practice. And there were people from multidisciplines in this group of 12 people. And I think for our practice, the idea of interdisciplinary work really was born during this residency, because we saw the importance of interdisciplinary encounters, because one can work within your own discipline and never have those conversations across other fields and thinking. So that was me just lying on the beach and reading and thinking through what we were doing, and also giving lectures about how what we know about some of the spatial violence that actually played out in natural landscapes, like, for instance, Red Hill, Luyolo, Komiki, and those areas. It was the first time for me to see this very rare flower called the Disa flower on Table Mountain, and just to think about how does one think through architectural practice as an ecology, not just as a kind of a spatial practice of bricks and mortar, but how do we think of it as a kind of a, ecology, and as a kind of a intervention into what clever people call the Anthropocene. So this idea of working with the land, understanding the land, thinking through the world differently through these encounters, really was provoked through this labor of walking with others. There's the word decolonizing, Heinrich. Are you happy with it? So maybe we should just say something about decolonizing. I think that our practice is disruptive and creatively unthinking, but we do feel like sometimes the word is co-opted by institutions and by spaces that are kind of intellectualizing this term and academicizing it, without the kind of track record of practicing it, and thinking through it. And this particular seminar was born out of a long trajectory of thinking through what does the term mean of decolonizing, of thinking about the remnants of coloniality with each other and space. Emotions was very important. So it was very strange to get a pushback from the Muizenberg Hysterical Conservation Society saying that we are emotive. I'm very emotive about these things, and it's important for our practice to do that. Last but not least,
I would like to say something about fragments, and you will see is that both Ilze and I produce fragments of many sorts in our work, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's an important part of our working method, and it's important to understand how it is a generative practice. So in being teachers, researchers, and practitioners, we are generalists. In being designers, scholars, project managers, heritage practitioners, dispute adjudicators, artists, advocates, parents, cooks, builders, urban designers, list goes on and on and on. We find ourselves to be generalists rather than specialists. We love working with specialists. We admire their skill and their depth and so on. We know we are not them, but as much as we love working with specialists, in meeting our aim of creating an architecture of consequence, in our context, we have found a broad and collaborative approach to be more effective than being specialized. It's for us, but that is a personal way in which we locate ourselves in the practice of architecture, and we're not demanding that other people should be like this. We truly love working with specialists, but we are generalists. We do not believe in the genius author. What we produce through conversation, what we understand through collaboration, what we gain through the particularities of circumstance, have an authentic generative power that is far richer than than the imagination of a single author. We often locate generative narratives outside of ourselves. In other words, we don't think that great ideas necessarily come from us. They could come from a building that we're working on. Our house, for instance, was a building that spoke to us and we spoke back to it. We find the narratives outside of ourselves. We find it's a good way of working. The story does not begin with us. We joined the party after it started, and we might not be the last people to leave. Architectural expression must reconcile a situated response with the poetics of this kind of authorship. Now, considering the urgency required to effect social, political, and economic change in South Africa, the capacity to imagine the full task is truly beyond a single individual. So we have to find ways of working and imagining with others. To produce an architecture of consequence, our confrontation with new ideas and our effectiveness as practitioners, teachers, and writers is enhanced through collaborations and diverse confrontations with the situations that require reflection and action. So we try and put ourselves in positions where other people help us understand what we're busy doing. This thing of producing double outcomes in our work, the practice of sowing confusion, the intermittent investigations of generalists, and the diverse inputs of a multitude of collaborators all tend to produce a multitude of fragments. Please not.
Oh, sorry.
Now, this is an issue because if you're working as a generalist, you're doing a whole lot of different things. You produce all these little fragments that pop up through all of these engagements. Now, what do you do with that? How do you work with that? How does it become useful? So, our working method is aimed at breaking apart, gathering new pieces, and making altogether new constructions. We've been inspired by Kada Atia's reflections on repair, and particularly his insistence that repairing something by projecting a sense of brokenness onto the fragment is the pursuit of the myth of perfection. So Kada Atia had you can go to the next image, had a certain fascination with Kuba textiles that comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we've just done a very big building. And we share his fascination with us, but I can first of all share his and then I'll share ours. So inspired by the decorative repair of the Kuba textile of the DRC, he argues that repair should be the beginning of something new. Atia's interest is in methods of repair that do not try to erase the signs of repair. So what happens in some of this textile is that they are softened by people pounding them, and they pound them until they make a hole in it. So you know it's really soft when you begin to make a hole. So most people say it's broken. Then you make a circular patch over that spot and you know the thing is right. So this logic of repair, he's got a real interest in. He is interested in the evolutionary process involved in the process of repair. So Atia argues that, and I'm quoting here, while in the Western world the act of repair, go to the next image and bear with me, these are images from his work. I'm going to quote Atia. While in the Western world the act of repair aimed at simply restoring an original shape, as in this plastic surgery performed on First World War victims, where they try and restore the original face. In traditional cultures, the repair aims further towards the creation of a new aesthetics. For the West, repair was an illusion of reappropriation of the self, but for non-Western cultures, the repair creates a new reality. End of quote. As architects, the work of repair redefines both our working method and the purposes of our work. We receive, search, and share the fragments. We develop both instrumental and poetic possibilities latent in the process of repair. Such possibilities should be provocative and open-ended. Exciting provocations inspire commitment and seriousness of others. It produces an open-endedness in a way and invites participation in the work. And that is the beauty, in a way, of producing a series of fragments. You don't have this impervious whole of some masterpiece that's produced that only the author can account for. A sense of the world as constituted out of a series of fragments can also be related to more than just the image of the broken. So I'm going to just skip through this. I'm just going to leave it at this for a moment. One of the texts that inspired me a great deal is a book by Homi Bhabha called The Location of Culture, and which an image of cultural identification is evoked, where the identity of a person or a city or anything is always constituted of a multitude of fragments of affiliation and association, as you would say. In working with the fragments, we treasure the correspondences and overlaps in the modes of affiliation and association. This idea is that we're putting these things new together and we're building new realities out of this thing. Our imaginings are substantially expanded by expanding with others and from a variety of vantage points. So it's not always about the broken. It's about saying is that in our character, in the character of other people, of groupings, of places, their character is fragmentary. You would say somebody is at one time an architect, a man, a sufferer of a disease, the husband of a certain person, the father of a child, a member of this golf club, part of this religious community, etc. And we move between these things, and we are different people in these different contexts. You are not all of these things all of the time. Your diabetes does not explain your religion. Your language does not explain the sports of preference, etc. And in that sense, he talks about our identities as various affiliations and associations. The expressive possibilities of assembling fragments, be they from multiple authors or diverse origins, is very exciting to us. Like Kada Atia, we've learned a great deal from Kuba Textile. I'm just going to put this one image there. I can show you a huge amount of these things that we've researched over the past while. So our interest in Kuba Textile has multiple sides to it, but we were involved in this temple in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's the national house of worship for the Baha'i community of the DRC. Now, in short, the raffia, many of the textiles in the DRC and the Cuba in particular is produced through a collaborative process. So men weave this raffia base, women do the embroidery, but the embroidery is very often done by a variety of women as pieces that's then put together. Now, these pieces have no immediate correspondence. They are not puzzle pieces. They don't lock into each other. They are of a similar tradition. Little girls are trained how to make patterns that follow a certain swing, a certain turn of a line, and so on. And then when these things come together, they look for correspondences, but they equally have lack of correspondence. And there's a certain syncopation that comes out of producing this kind of a artwork that's a collaborative artwork. So reflecting on our own practice, we may well lack this confidence of method that you find in practices like this that's gone on for a very long time. But the challenges of our time require invention more than confidence, we would argue. And there was something, I see Hannah is here. Hannah once gave a lecture about, I'm terrible, my memory is terrible, about a man, I think a Nigerian architect who married a Nigerian woman. And I think his confidence in modernism forsook him. And he exchanged certainty for uncertainty. And the work went from what will everyone publish to what very few would be interested in. And it really inspired me, this lack of confidence that is so immense leap forward. so as I was saying, is I think it requires, I've now lost my track of thought. Our moment requires invention more than confidence, and it helps us to break with tradition in a way. By collaborating with musicians, artists, designers, engineers, activists, students, makers, cooks, hustlers, dilettantes, we can graft our methods in a way on their roots. What we lack in confidence, what we lack in a confident conformance to a tradition, we make up through the poetics of our syncopated music with others in a way. One could well ask, what are the key contributions that a generalist can make which are equivalent in consequence to our specialist colleagues? So how can a generalist design a hospital if you have specialist hospital designers? Can a specialist hospital designer not always do a better hospital than a generalist who's actually never designed a hospital? Or, I mean, we can give several examples. So the question is, do generalists have value in various forms of architectural practice like what we've described? Generalists have to generate a new image of the profession and its possibilities, which is compelling, exciting, and convincing. By necessity, such an image is often rich in its breadth, but lacking in its detail. Would it be good enough to say that the specialist could go and fill the gaps that the generalist made? We don't think so. Being professional means being responsible in the judgments that we make or the positions that we profess. To achieve this, there are 2 points that I would like to highlight in the development of a responsible position. The first relate to checking the nature of the full image. And the second has to do with checking of consequences. The work of a generalist architect can move between 2 opposite positions. The first is an output which is complete and which is scrutinized for completeness, such as a set of technical drawings issued for construction. The other would be a loose and provocative position generated out of fragments where the pieces are more like a constellation of stars than all the fragments of a broken bowl. Research outputs, activist positions, or design provocations are very often of this sort of constellation of stars type thing. When we invoke the image of a constellation of stars, there certainly has to be a larger image inferred, which we are the authors of. We can't just throw those fragments out and assume that somebody else will take responsibility for, or somebody else will check what is this whole image that we are producing. We could not create the pieces and distance ourselves from the whole. How then do we check the inferred full picture? So one of the things that has inspired us greatly is the work that was done by a South African, a woman called Katie Bowman, who worked with a bunch called the Event Horizon Telescope. I think some of you might know about this, but they set out to photograph a black hole. It is impossible to photograph a black hole. What they worked out is you need a radio telescope the size of planet Earth in order to get the data that you needed to. And then some smart aleck, in the person of Dr. Katie Bowman, came up with this idea that you could use the radio telescopes that we have on the planet, and considering that the planet is turning, you just keep on going as these things go, as the radio telescope move across the planet, you could then have an area the size of the planet from which you take photographs of this. You need a particularly cloudless day, etc., etc., etc. Remarkable science, a bunch of people working together on this. But they wrote an algorithm basically for getting all of these pieces together. So they produced so many fragments, bits of information, that they put it on hard drives on a jumbo jet to move it from one place to the other. The fragments were too big to move by any thing Wi-Fi network, WeTransfer could not help them. The question was, if you have all of these things, how do you know you photographed a black hole if you don't know what it looks like? So they wrote algorithms to detect what the likely image of it would be. And then they checked whether it conformed to other things. So they, for instance, saw, could it potentially describe an elephant? Is there a chance that this thing could describe a London bus or something? And they found ways of saying, well, there must be certain characteristics. In other words, they had a certain sense of the whole and a certain sense of whether the fragments conformed to the narrative of that whole. And this work has inspired us greatly in a way in that they took responsibility for both a sense of the whole and a sense of the fragments. I can talk about this, but I think in some of the stuff that Ilze described through the pamphlet exercise, I think if you pick up one pamphlet, it's one story. But if you can pick up 10 of them, you'll see that sense of fragments begin to tell a different kind of a story. The second point I want to expand on here in our method is on the consequences of our provocations and our proposals. Because, there's again this image of this sort of reckless practitioner who just comes up with crazy ideas. But the question is, do we take responsibility and do we check the future consequences of it? We often say to students that we do two things in design. We make configurations and then we check the consequences. We have developed ways of advancing ideas in the city with a conservative urban culture, a context that's risk-averse, and a situation where the leaps of our imagination result in disbelief or a lack of comprehension that we proposed. It sounds very glamorous. I'm telling you, it's intensely unglamorous. To sit in a meeting where you come up with a great idea and all your client wants to do is to fire you because they cannot comprehend what you're saying. And it's not their problem. It's your problem because you're the one who gets fired. Sometimes people relate better to ideas which are cited within the continuum of thought rather than ideas that's presented as one enormous breakthrough. So if I can show them that this idea is around, if I can show them that they've generated part of the ideas, if we can show them that this is part of a discussion that we've been having over the past 3 years, the leap of the imagination is not so big and our chance of getting fired is far less. Yeah. The capacity to demonstrate how we have manifested ideas through prior exercises and implementation reduces the anxiety that innovative work produces. The question then is, how can you make truly original moves? If you're saying you always try and cite it in a continuum, where does original ideas come in if you do that? So the one domain is, next one, is through the university. And I think University of Johannesburg has a good legacy of doing this, is we experiment with work in the university, we come up with public exhibitions, we have public discourse about it. This was work that I did as the Charles Correa Chair of Architecture at the University of Goa. And we did these exhibitions of the final project in the Kala Academy, that was a Charles Correa building. I don't have to speak much about it. I think that practice happens here, and I think it's well understood. Sometimes the clients do not exist for the consequences that we are in pursuit of. So it's not a design that we are in pursuit of. It's not a configuration we are in pursuit of. We want a certain consequence. If we want an architecture of consequence, if we want to transform our society, we're in search of certain consequences. And in order to get involved in those consequences, we self-initiate work. We go to the next one. We start projects like this one I showed before. We make the exhibitions, we write the publications, we make the text, etc., etc. We elicit those responses as a way of accelerating the public engagement with us, as a way of people knowing that we're interested to get involved in it. In such a way, we are in search of the consequences that we want to be involved in. We are also get involved through checking consequences, through simulation exercises. Next one. And this is some of the work that I did at Harvard University in the urban design studio that I presented last year, where we were invading a golf course in Cape Town. We tried to see if we can invade it over a weekend. Now, this was an urban design course at Harvard, and the question is there anything an urban designer can do if you are proposing the invasion of a golf course? Does our discipline have any relevance? How can we be responsible doing it? How do we know what we're doing? And we were saying, well, it's like a pilot, you know. If you are flying in a plane and the engine is on fire, does the pilot go on the microphone, start screaming, so, oh hell, we're all going to die right now? That would not be cool, would it? If the pilot says, don't worry, people, I've done this once before, what would you say? Like, ooh. But if the pilot said, I've done this 5,000 times before, and I have a 99.7% success rate of landing this plane, what would you say? Cool bananas, let's go. You stay in front there, I'll sit back here. I'll keep quiet. And in the same way, we are saying if architects have to act at times when our judgment is desperately required, but we have to act fast because the matter of urban transformation requires fast action. Maybe we can check it out through exercises where we check the consequences. So because it was lockdown, global lockdown, and Harvard has money, I proposed that they send VR headsets to everybody from China to Lima. We had a virtual classroom, which we designed. There's all of us around this virtual models. And we are talking, so we don't know where everybody is. I know where they are in the world. Some people are 2 o'clock in the morning, some 5 in the morning. We're sitting discussing models, keep going. We can fly over the cities that we are busy designing. All of this were built by the students. Or next one, we can walk in the streets and we can begin to check the consequences of what we're doing. So in other words, we accelerate our engagement with the subject and we are not reckless about it. We are making sure that we advance our understandings, that when we have to make judgment under great speed, like a surgeon or a pilot, that we are prepared for it. And in that sense, it's important to understand the consequences. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up very quickly by a very brief statement without elaborating on this thing. There is a thing that Ashraf Jamal said, is that what South Africa demands of us is to inhabit the horror. And it's a very dramatic statement, and if you know the text, it's a very dramatic text that it comes out of. But I could not fault him in his insight and saying, well, we firstly have to inhabit this horror, and then we can begin to possibly think about how to displace it. But we should move away of this axis of good and evil and so on, of this is right, that is wrong, and so on. He's saying, let's just inhabit this thing first. But Ilze and I have been very much inspired by the writings of an American poet, a cultural theorist, and a scholar, a guy called Fred Moten, who in a way said that in the study of anti-blackness, you've got to celebrate black lives, in essence, if I'm paraphrasing. And it made a huge impression on us because we realized we could, in the pursuit of everything that is so at odds with how we think it should be, that has so many residues of horror of the past, we could lose ourselves and we can go crazy. But there's something about celebrating the joy in what we are doing, in the black lives that we come across, in the insights that we come across, and so on. And that there's something about finding a balance between the criticism and the joy that becomes the originating force in a way that keeps us going and keeps us at it. Thank you very much.
The quote by Fred Moten is more about how do we analyze anti-blackness in service of its eradication, and how do we think through this analysis as a space for emancipatory practice, which is kind of what we are on about. And this is just kind of a broad outline of how how do we practice and how do we find methodologies towards that, space of finding freedom? We're just trying to practice freedom. And in the words of Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. So it is a struggle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
None of them provided guidance on how to finish on time.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mngolisi Makubo, the convener of the GSA's Architectural History and Theory program. I'll be attempting to facilitate the Q&A session. So this is part love letter, part thank you note, part prologue to the Q&A session. Thank you, Ilze and Heinrich, for continually challenging us to expand our imagination of practice. I am mainly and selfishly so inspired by your practice's critique of typical architectural methodology via Ben Makubane's clarion call to produce with a full view of global structural factors while responding appropriately to local conditions. One can trace that in your oscillation between research and experiments in making methodologies which are not only concerned with research as an and in itself, but are concerned with new habits of assembly and cumulatively altering the ways we think about making architecture. So thank you for keeping us on our toes and reminding us to pursue madness. So we had asked a few students to ask a few questions. A few opted out because all their questions had been answered. But because you guys are just so great. But Tanya has one question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Tanya, where are you? Yes, please.
Hi. I just wrote it down.
Please go for it.
So Heinrich spoke about finding our authenticity and original voice and new perspective and understanding when working and challenging the limitations and views that we are taught by our lecturers and institutions. But I wanted to know how a current student could go about doing that. And in part, you answered that question when you talked about the relation to push against the Rhodes House project. And although the GSA is a lot more open and willing for students to explore the question, what about students that don't have that opportunity and that are institutions that are being policed by those expectations by the institution?
The thing is that we don't have guardians. You can think people are policing you. You can get fired. We, from time to time, going to meetings, say we think we will get fired now. Nobody says you have to do anything. Nobody says you have to work for a certain employer. Nobody says you have to do a certain project. You can opt out of it. It's much better breaking it off while there's no blood on the floor. It's just, I don't believe that you have to do anything. But you don't have to get a certain job, etc., etc. But the question is for students is that, Ilze and I have been at it for a while, and I can tell you 20 years ago we were not so clear about all of this. When we graduated, we were certainly not clear about this. But I think that I am a very big believer personally in that you've got to just be yourself. A friend of mine is a very well-known comedian. He once told a story about the first girl he kissed, and he was telling the story, and people were laughing. He was being ridiculous about how awkward a 13-year-old can be. And he was, it was ridiculous. This story was outrageous. And I sat there in shock and horror, because I realized he's just telling the truth. I know that girl. I know she's down the road. She's real. And he was just actually telling how he kissed her and how stupid he was at doing it. And people are rolling in the aisles and paying him good money for it. And what was interesting for me about that is that there's something about the capacity
to just be yourself and be it in public and to say, this is who I am, this is where I come from, this is what I know, this is who my parents were, and this is the world that I saw. And I think in teaching, for us, it's a very big focus in a way, not on what you should be learning, but in a way on what you know through your own embodied experience of your own life or your family histories or so on. So I would say that is always a good place to start. And then I don't believe in a view of an engagement with the world where there's this thing that you must do, like there's this calling. I have a sense more, it's like, you cross the one-way road like our office is in a one-way road. Next thing, there's an Uber coming from the other side to kill you. It's like, it sort of comes at you like that. You think you know what you're doing, and then something else comes at you. And then you have to deal with this very quickly. And that sort of becomes your life, whether the car hits you or not. And there's something about having a sense of what comes across your life, who comes across your life. What are those moments where you realize, but I could do something here, this could be useful. This Rhodes Cottage thing, I don't think we knew what we were going to do. We tendered for it, was a public tender, City of Cape Town. We had an inkling what we could do. Yeah, we were desperate for work, which happens from time to time. And then you do this thing, but you kind of develop a confidence that somehow you'll do it. So people ask us to do an expensive house now recently, first one ever. And it's, we think we can do an expensive house, or somebody wants to ask us to do a hospital, and you think, oh, we think we can do a hospital. Now, there's no actually rational basis for this. But there's something about a sense of a working with and a sense of engagement, and these things come across your path. It's not that I want to be known as a hospital designer, but this thing came across our paths, and we think that it's a way of exercising. When I spoke about exercises, we think if we once do a hospital, then we can do anything else, because there's so many services in the roof. If we can wrestle this monster down to the ground, we can wrestle all the other monsters with aircon and MEP services down to the ground. So let's do a hospital. Little knowing what we're going to do. So I would encourage students not to panic too much. If there's no great vision speaking down onto you, don't worry, It might come much later, but there's just things that happen. But listen to what's happening to you. Keep your ears open to the world that's there and the world that's really presenting to you. Not the one that your teachers presented, because they had a certain expectation of what the world would be, and it just never is that. It's not their fault. It's in a way for you to be awake to the world that you live in. That's the advice I would give. I don't know if it answers the question.
I'm interested in the connection between literature and architecture, especially when it comes to Bessie Head. And I'm interested in how you came into her work as opposed to any other African writer, and what that connection was and what that interest was.
It was very, very tentative in the beginning, and the connection grew as I started learning more about the Bessie Head's legacy, because I found out quite soon to kind of looking at her work that her house in Serowe is a national heritage site. And I started meditating on what that means for kind of discipline of heritage, and how that can be a lesson for us in South Africa, that a very simple house could be like that. But then she also wrote prolifically about space. The question of power is about a gardening project and the impact of space on gardening. There is Village of the Rainwind, which is an anthropological and a spatial study, urban design study, actually, of that part of the world, where she kind of looked at the spatial setup of that area in many disciplines. It's an interdisciplinary study, but she calls it the Village of the Rainwind. So I think she made a definite impact in the way she imagined space, the way she thought through in kind of both her non-fiction and her fiction writings around what she thinks. And I think that for us, she's a kind of a beacon for what a kind of emancipatory practice could look like for an architectural people that are concerned with architecture. And there are many people in the literary world that one can look at. Tambudza Marashera is also one. He constructed an office in the middle of Harare, which he imagined as a kind of a space to gather stories after after the independence of Zimbabwe, because people needed to find a place to have their stories heard, and he typed them up as people came, and he inhabited the city in particular ways. People, our friends at Chimeringa has recently written about how he inhabited Harare, for instance. So there are these people beyond the kind of beyond the traditions of architecture as we know it, the professional confines of architecture that have impacted on our thinking, that we are learning about now, that we can gather wisdom from.
Sorry, thank you, Ilze and Heinrich, for that talk. I just have one question. You deal with race and gender in some of your works, and those are topics that are difficult to talk about. And of late, there was a very sort of like a phrase coined by, I think, an American author called white fragility, that spoke about why it's difficult for white people to speak about race. And I just wanted to know, how do you deal with white fragility? Because at times when you think of the word race, somebody might think, oh, that includes Black people, Indian people. Possibly as a white individual, they might not feel that they're included in the story of race. So how do you deal with white fragility for people who it is difficult to talk about race? And also how do you have any like a stealth approach as to how you can make it seem more of a universal story than just, a story that's isolated to a certain group of people? I don't know if that's clear.
I'm not taking on the burden of dealing with white fragility because that's not my project. But I do think that through this idea of looking at our spaces that have been constructed through an aspiration of whiteness, that is particularly a kind of a important project for us to engage in. How is a city been formed around constructions of race? And the work around Rex Trueform is particular in trying to find a specific case. It's not. I don't believe in a kind of universal answer, but I think there are specific cases that can add to a plural understanding of very big concepts like race, constructions of race, whiteness, fragility, all those things. And with the case of Rex Trueform, it was very apparent that architecture is complicit in constructions of race. And we need to learn how architecture is complicit in this to begin to not repeat mistakes. And in addition, not to repeat mistakes or these constructions, how do we begin to develop spaces of emancipation from those constructions, which is kind of our underlying concern. But I can't be bothered with, issues of white fragility. I don't know if you can, Heinrich, but I can't. Sorry.
There's a dimension to which issues of race cannot be denied, even if it's being denied. Now, it's difficult to work in conditions where it's being denied if it cannot be denied. In our mind, it cannot be denied. But there is sometimes the Trojan horse that has to be sent through the gates. And we do this thing of designing a double project. We have done many, many ways where you design one building that on the face of it is one thing, but in its fundamental makeup, there's something else. But to people who deny the importance of race, say in the city or in architecture and so on, they of course cannot see what you're busy doing. The denial makes them blind to it being repaired or being dealt with. So without naming any specific names, there are projects where we really, really design two projects. We're talking about one in the office, you're presenting another one. You talk about the feasibility in the meetings, because that makes the building happen. They check the feasibility, the thing goes ahead, but there's a whole other project there. And then by the time the thing is built, there's a certain operation that sets certain things in motion, and then it can't be stopped in a way. I don't know if that answers your question, but one can't talk away what exists. You can't, well, if people deny it, it's very hard to deal with it. It makes it very difficult. But there are ways of conniving your way around it. One can be sweet about it, or you can connive around it, and both, I think, have their spaces. You know, one of the texts that has inspired us, it's a book that's about to come out now by Pramesh Lalu, called Undoing Apartheid, where he talks about two things that exist in apartheid. We say the project of apartheid on the one hand constitute grand apartheid, forced removals, Group Areas Act, the laws, all of those sorts of things. But then he said at an interpersonal level, there's what he calls petty apartheid. And he's saying that is an acidic force, the power of race as being the double bind of apartheid, this thing that keeps on coming back and so on. And, you know, in his mind, you know, the thing is, how do you displace this thing in favor of a new definition of ourselves and so on? And I think that would be a good reference point, perhaps.
So I wanted to ask, I have two questions. The first one is, I liked what you said about sowing confusion, and how there's a distinction between tilling the soil and breaking the soil. But I also wanted to find out, like, how does one make that distinction in terms of tilling as a way to kind of produce something as opposed to just breaking? And is that in the prototype that one would make that distinction, or is it after the thing has been done and it's kind of after the fact? And then the other question is in relation to the kind of disembodiment of the body in terms of making, you know, how do you make something with your hands without the judgment of the eye? So then what measures do you use as the judgment? If you don't use the judgment of the eye, do you have to create new judgments for what the hand does? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
It's very nice questions, because it's all related to judgment, you know, and you know, there are wonderful books that people have written about judgment and so on. And the first question was about tilling the soil. I often think that our responses to many of our attitudes are between different poles of actions, and there's a kind of a calibrated response. You can't say this way is always the good way and that way is the bad way. You know, in certain contexts, it is different. You know, so for instance, we designed a temple for the Bai community of the DRC. It's a large amount of people. It's a big international community that has an interest in this temple. To what extent can I claim the space just disrupt and so on? You know, to what extent is it necessary if people say want to give expression to equality in this building, et cetera, et cetera? So when do you disrupt and when don't you? But there's a sense is that they like tilling the soil. There's a season for it. So there are these moments where you just go and do it. And it's, you say, well, after the rains, I got to dig the plow into the field and I got to till the soil. And there are, you know, is that you can't wait for the beginning of a project to try and think great thoughts. It's too late. You've got to be busy with it, and you've got to put yourself in that traffic that sort of passes you by. I spoke about this thing of a car almost driving into you in the street kind of thing, but you kind of have to be in the street to be in that situation. The question is about judgment. You know, I think maybe I'll start in a roundabout way. Is the question is whether you put yourself in the center of it. So am I the genius author who will decide when disruption will occur
This is the time for disruption. You should be disrupted. This is wrong. This must be fixed. Is that a space that one could, as an individual, just occupy, that authoritarian position of the designer? Or is there something about a conversation that you want to have with a group of people as to the motives which they see as the motives for something else? And then establishing that those motives are at odds, maybe with a brief that they just gave you, or with a habit of building a certain school or a hospital, or of doing a conservation management plan. I can tell you the City of Cape Town did not necessarily expect that we're going to do what we did. They accepted it afterwards. But the question is, at what point does the sharp end of that hoe go into the soil, and you say to the ox, go, we now going to rip, you know. And that has to do with a sense that you take people along with you. I often use the image of a parachute instructor. You know, I know as a teacher, I cannot go on the first day and start crazy radical stuff. You lose the students. They don't want to go with you. If they can trust me, I can hold on to them and push them out of the plane and say, I promise you this thing will go open. Just let's jump, go. But there's something, you know, so that is in a teacher-student relationship, which is much more one-on-one, but it's also in the class, because if the class does not believe that this instructor is worth his or her salt, nobody will jump, okay? But when you're doing some project, you cannot just go there and go and blare out genius ideas. Nobody's going to fall for that. There's something about building up an expectation that this is necessary. Why is this so? You know, what necessitates this? Why is disruption in the interest of this thing? And there are many reasons, and it's actually easier to find than you think. So disruption is in a way in which it manifests, but it very often starts with dinners and talks and walks and all sorts of social engagements, you know, where it really doesn't look like you working at all. And we've done stuff where I can see the clients are you ever going to draw this plan? Are you going to get on with this? And they're like, what are you talking about? You say, no, we are moving this thing along to somewhere where we can just ignite this thing. Okay. The second judgment had to do with bodiliness. So the thing is that what you do is that it's a practice. It's like imagining your hands floating. So we've done lots of buildings for puppeteers, where you have a dead thing that you set alive by getting some of the parts to move together, you know, because they don't move together, you don't know what's going on. So you've got to get the parts to move together. So you've got to know, I'm sitting and I'm drawing now. It sounds weird, but I got to sit on my ass and I got to do this for a while, because there's got to be a series of drawings that come out here, because the first few might just be arrangements, because I'm really struck by a complex brief and I'm making arrangements. So I got to get to this point where I draw something that's at odds with what I've been asked to do, because I'm beginning to understand it so well. But there's something about saying, well, I got to draw with something that produces instability. A blunt instrument produces more instability than the sharp instrument. Pencil does better than a computer. You know, you can go on like that. A model shows you light in a way that a drawing does not show you light. I cannot understand light through drawing. I understand light through models, etc., etc. So you go between these things, and it's one is it's a practice, and you put yourself in that position that it begins to happen. It's like saying, well, you know, you want to create a romantic evening. You know, you can't just say, now, let's have romance. It's good. The questions about judgment. So now, the first thing I think in that judgment is a suspension of judgment. So in other words, you think you're busy drawing the stair of the house, and you're drawing it, but you've got to be able to confuse your comprehension of your own task so much that you could say to yourself, could this be a garden? You say, but I mean, I'm really thinking about the fire escape from there to there. And you say, but imagine it's a garden. So this thing, imagine if, this thing of role-playing is a very big thing that brings that thing up. And judgment has to do with a superimposition of a set of needs with a series of circumstances. So you project onto it a possible thing. So somebody asks you to do a house, and you say, but what if this house works like a certain constructional system that produces a certain sociability that we've produced in a public building? And you think, geez, we pulled it off in that other building, but I could never do it in a house, because you give yourself 20 reasons. You say, but what if we can do it? Or, one of the things that we would do is we would draw a section that doesn't fit the plan at all. And why would you do that? You're just making a lot of work for yourself. You know the section doesn't fit the plan. But there's something about saying, well, maybe the section's more beautiful than the plan, and I got to adjust the plan to fit with the section. But maybe the plan is more beautiful than the section, and then the section's got to be made to adjust that. So you produce these discrepancies. And the judgment has to do with beauty and pleasure and meaning. And, also in conversation, sometimes we suspend judgment. We show people and we say, what do you see? It sounds very weird to say, but how can I come up with something great and not know that it's in front of me? So I don't know. Like ask you, what do you see? And you say, no, it looks like a dog. You say, you're kidding me. Does it look like a dog? Let's make it more like a dog. You say, okay, we can make it more like a dog. Let's do that. And there you go. And you wander off. So it's judgments that come out of various projections, conversations, and so on. But there's something in keeping your eye open for the opportunity in that mismatch that you produced, realizing itself. This thing of what if is the fundamental imagining that I think you're busy with.
Thank you so much. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for making time to come, but especially more Ilze and Heinrich. For all of you, please keep your eyes on the GSA Instagram page or social media pages for future events. Thank you so much. Please drive home safely.